Israel. The images that we all saw recently culminating this past Monday, images of civil unrest in Israel, were images that most of us thought we would never see. Images of demonstrations of thousands upon thousands of Israelis and counter-demonstrations. Images of the Ayalon artery, a major road into Tel Aviv, being just blocked, wall-to-wall people. Universities closing. The airport, Ben Gurion Airport, closed for business. The Histadrut declaring a general strike. You had IDF soldiers and reservists and pilots. These are Israeli warriors. These are Israeli heroes. These are Israelis who have put their lives on the line for the state of Israel, saying no more, not now. Not if Israel isn't going to remain a democracy. We had never seen that before. We had ambassadors whose job is always to defend the government that they're the ambassador for, criticizing the government that they're the ambassador for, being fired. You had Yoav Gallant, the Secretary of Defense, saying that there should be dialogue instead of imposition, for which he was fired and for which he became a national hero. You had Israel on the verge of imploding. Just as Israel is about to be marking its 75th birthday in a few weeks, this month in April. And just as we are all about to sit down to our Seder tables Wednesday night and Thursday night, which raises, of course, the question of the Jewish world. Do we talk about Israel at our Seders? And if we do, how do we do that, and what do we say? Because, to be honest, it feels like a no-win situation. If we don't talk about Israel, then we are not talking about what matters. And if we do talk about Israel, it's just depressing, and where does it lead? But into a ditch. I got a sense of how complicated it is to talk about Israel and even to pray for Israel last Shabbos. Shira and I were visiting our son Sam, who lives in Brooklyn, and we went to shul with him at a shul in Brooklyn, in Williamsburg, called the Alt Shul. And it's a minyan of people in their 20s and 30s. You know, very often Jewish professionals ask, where are all the young people? And the answer is they're at the Alt Shul. This was a minyan of energy, 20s, 30s, and these are Jews who are maximally observant and maximally knowledgeable. They're running the whole service from soup to nuts, from A to Z. They're doing everything, singing, chanting, preaching, talking. Amazing. And it was such a happy service. The 20-somethings and 30-somethings that we're always worrying about were there owning their Judaism. And then it came time for the prayer for our country, which they read together, the whole minyan, and it was jam-packed. An ordinary Shabbos, there wasn't a bar mitzvah, a bat mitzvah, just jam-packed. They read the prayer for the country, just like we do, the same prayer. And then came the prayer for Israel. And I saw something there that I had never seen before. They couldn't pray together a prayer for Israel. Instead, at everybody's seat was a blue laminated card. And each person there had 3 choices for private, silent prayer. You could pray to yourself, the traditional prayer for Israel that Elias just chanted so beautifully, but to yourself. You could say to yourself an alternative version, a different prayer for Israel. Or you could just offer up your own thoughts or no thoughts in this slot for Israel. And at the end, the congregation came together to sing a prayer for peace. And I was just struck by this. And so I asked for the backstory. I'd never seen this. So I went up to the leadership of the Minyan, and I said, could you tell me the backstory? And they said, well, the Minyan debated this question for 7 months. And there was a large segment of the community. These are knowledgeable Jews, passionate Jews, committed Jews, empowered Jews, that didn't want to pray for Israel at all. And those part of the community that did want to pray for Israel couldn't agree on what to say, so they came up with a compromise, which was this silent prayer compromise. And I found that very sobering. And it suggests that we cannot talk about Israel at our Seder tables. It's just too fraught. And we cannot not talk about Israel at our Seder tables. It's just too important. So what do? So I got some wisdom on this, of course, from Andy Stanley. I was listening to Andy Stanley, the great preacher in Atlanta. He wasn't talking about Israel. It was a podcast on leadership, and he was talking about a book by Charles Duhigg called The Power of Habit. And he was talking about chapter 4 of this book, The Power of Habit. And chapter 4 of The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, he talks about what he calls a keystone habit. Not all habits are created equal. A keystone habit is a habit that is so powerful that if you do this keystone habit, it causes all kinds of other conduct, all kinds of other habits in its wake. An example of a keystone habit is daily exercise. If you exercise every day, that's a keystone habit because now you're more focused than you otherwise would be on your physical health. And then you'll eat better, and you'll drink better, and you'll sleep better, and you'll feel better, and then you'll be better at home and at work. Daily exercise is a keystone habit. It just makes you better. Here's another keystone habit. Andy Stanley brings this out in his podcast. A family eating dinner together every night is a keystone habit. It's good relationally and nutritionally and financially. If a family sits down together every night for dinner, of course they check in. How was your day? How was your day? What were the ups? What were the downs? They check in. It's good nutritionally. It's better food. And it's cheaper than if you go out. Keystone habits cause conduct downfield. Now, the Jewish people and the state of Israel need a good keystone habit now. Because as all of the analysts point out, what happened after the country was on the verge of imploding is a pause. Nothing got resolved. It's just a pause. In Danny Gordis's language and his essay yesterday, there's a ceasefire in Israel between the warring Jewish camps. And the all-important question is, what is going to happen now during that ceasefire? And if nothing happens during the ceasefire to move the needle, then when the ceasefire is over and the country resumes in a few weeks after Passover, there was a whole daily about this on Thursday. Patrick Kingsley, the bureau chief in Jerusalem of the Times, made the point that if nothing happens, then we'll be back to a combustible point of the country imploding again. So something has to happen. We need a keystone habit to change the trajectory. And the good news is we have it. And the good news is it's a core Jewish value. It's actually linked to our most urgent prayer, which is Shema Yisrael. Listen, Israel. The keystone habit is listening. Listening to each other, especially when we don't agree, is a keystone habit. And not listening is a keystone habit. Both have consequences downstream. Now, in his editorial this week in the Times, Bret Stephens quotes Benny Gantz, who is a former defense minister and leader of the opposition. He says as follows, and Micha Goodman has said the same thing, although their numbers are different. Benny Gantz says that 80% of Israelis want the same thing. 80% of Israelis want judicial reform which will tweak the judicial system to deal with legit problems, but will preserve the judicial system's independence and therefore will preserve Israel as a democracy. Benny Gantz says 80%, Micha gives the number 70%, but a clear landslide majority of Israelis want that. And why isn't it happening? Very simply because to date, Israelis have not been listening to each other. In fact, what happened is that the not listening is the Keystone habit, because there's a demonstration which engenders a counter-demonstration. There's anger, which engenders anger. There's recriminations, which engenders recriminations. So this Shabbat, Rachel Korasim, who was an Israeli teacher of poetry, was doing a class on Zoom for a Talmud class, and she told the most amazing story and also the most amazing graphic. Her stepson, that is her husband Yossi's son Ophir, has served in the IDF for 30 years. And Ophir, her stepson, is one of the leaders of getting IDF soldiers and reservists to not serve if the country they're serving is not going to be a democracy. They signed up to serve for a Jewish state and a democratic state, a democracy. And if it's not going to be democratic, they don't want to serve. And he's the leader of this movement. And so Rachel has all these pictures and tells the following narrative, which is that Saturday night, Ophir and lots of other Jews from Tel Aviv, Israelis, went to Jerusalem en masse because Yoav Gallant, after speaking out, got fired and the country was at a boiling point. And so thousands upon thousands of angry protesters were marching on Jerusalem. And there they were met by a substantial amount of equally angry Israelis who were for the government. And there was a lot of anger and a lot of upset. And there was no listening going on. And then Rachel says that her stepson Ophir says, no, this is not the way. And he goes up to a ger chassid in the black hat, looking like a chassid, and he says, you know, we're both Israelis and we're both Jews, but we're obviously on very different side of this question. Will you have a cup of coffee with me? And this ger chassid leaves his group of protesters. And Ophir Korasim leaves his group of protesters, and they literally go have a cup of coffee for 2 hours. Common sense, not common practice. Clearly what the country needs, clearly not what is happening in the country. And in fact, as Rachel then showed us on her, with the wonders of technology, the fact that Ophir and this ger chassid, a secular Israeli and a chassid, are having coffee went viral. And there are all these images of them. And then, in fact, they were invited to go to a very, very Orthodox yeshiva in Sderot, which is near Gaza. This is like very hardcore Ben Gvir territory. This is very hardcore ram the judicial reform through Israel, and if it doesn't become a democracy, even better yet, territory. And her stepson is in dialogue with the whole yeshiva. And that's hard, and that is what Israel needs. Listening is a keystone habit which strengthens relationships, which brings us to our seders. We could achieve peace. We could achieve peace at our seders by simply ignoring the issue of the day. But here's another move. Why don't we try the keystone habit of listening? So last week, Daniel Hartman and Yehuda Kurtzer sent out a letter, and in the spirit of the season, it asks 4 questions that are very simple. And any of these questions will prompt a really good conversation around your Seder table. First question, is Israel central to you, to your life? Or if you're being honest about it, is Israel not central to your life as a human or as a Jew? And if you could imagine the people around your Seder table and the different generations and your college freshman who comes in from Oberlin or Berkeley, you could imagine different points of view. Second question, who owns Israel? Do only Israelis own Israel? Or do all Jews own Israel? Daniel Hartman always quotes his late father, David Hartman, as saying that Israel is way too important to be owned only by Israelis. It's got to be owned by all of the Jewish people. And the question for you is, do you feel a personal ownership stake in Israel? And if so, what does that mean to you? Third question from Daniel and Yehuda's letter. Of course, it's important that Israel is a sanctuary for the Jewish people in a world of rising hate. But is Israel also a laboratory for the best Jewish values, where the best ideals of justice shall you pursue, are lived out in the street? And if there is a gap between Jewish ideals and Jewish practice, what does that gap say to you? Does that gap claim you? What's your response to that gap? And the final question, of course, the issue of the day, Israel has to be a Jewish state. Has to be. And Israel has to be a democracy where the rights of all of its citizens are respected. Has to be. And these, Jewish, democratic, are in tension. Hard to do and essential to be done. And how do we navigate that tension? Now, if you raise those questions, what would happen? So the purpose is to listen. To listen is not to persuade. And to listen is not to convince. To listen is to learn. And in the process of listening and learning, you actually strengthen relationships. And if it turns out you can't actually talk to other people on the issues of the day that matter, that inability to listen weakens relationships. So the story is told of a rabbi who officiates at the funeral of somebody who lives, a guy who lives till he's 95. And he had a beautiful life. And at the service for this 95-year-old, the children just speak glowingly about their father. And the grandchildren go on and on and on about their grandfather. And business associates and friends and people from the community all talk about what an amazing man this man was who died at 95 years old. It's a beautiful celebration of a long and beautiful life. And yet the rabbi notes and sees that this man who died had a brother, and this brother looks really, really sad. And the rabbi is focused on this brother's eyes. They're just deeply sad eyes. And so after the funeral's over, the rabbi goes to the surviving brother and says, "Sir, I couldn't help but notice how sad you looked. I was drawn to your eyes. I couldn't help but notice your sad eyes. And I get that your brother just died and that he lived till 95 and was so beloved. What's going on?" And the brother says, "Rabbi, my brother and I had a disagreement 20 years ago, and we stopped talking to one another. And we stopped listening to one another. And now 20 years have just gone by. Where can I get that time back? Where can we get that time back? At your Seder tables, listen. In your life, listen. That is why the credo of our people is Shema Yisrael. Shabbat Shalom.